CZ Shadow 2 trigger mechanism explained in 10 minutes or less. So these are the components of the trigger mechanism in the CZ Shadow 2. Actually, these components are shared across multiple CZ handguns, Shadow 2, Shadow 1, SPO1. They all kind of share the same mechanism here. SPO1, as an exception, will have what is called a fire and pain block that is not represented here because that's not present on the Shadow 2 or Shadow 1 guns. But aside from the fire and pain block, pretty much everything else is the same. So let's talk about each of these components and how they individually influence on the trigger pull weight and the trigger feeling that you have. First components we're going to talk about is the trigger return spring and the trigger shoe. The trigger return spring, this spring that you see in the picture right here, its function is to return the trigger to the original position. So once you pull the trigger back, something needs to push that trigger back to the original position, and this is what this spring does. Therefore, when you're pulling the trigger, you're going against that spring, and using the reduced power spring will then relieve some weight on the trigger pull. So the trade-off on that is you gain on weight, but you also lose on how tactical your reset is. So using a lighter spring will create a less tactical and kind of a slower reset. So you need to balance that out on what you want, less weight and less tactical reset. The other thing here is the trigger shoe. So the trigger shoe, it starts with the geometry and the engagement with the trigger bow or trigger bar. So the connection between this piece here and this done through a pin through both of these holes aligned will create different lever systems. So depending on how that is designed, you can have a lever that is different and creates more of a feeling is more weight or less weight, and also a different feeling overall on how your trigger goes. So the other thing that's going to be important here as well is the face of the trigger shoe. That could be more, I see this curve here, could be more or less curve. The angle could be different. You could also have a flat trigger with no curve at all. That all changes where your finger is positioned on the trigger, more towards the center, towards the up or bottom, and that will all change the lever that you have between the trigger and the trigger bow, and therefore the feeling and the trigger weight. The last thing about trigger shoe is you can have set screws controlling the travel, pre and post travel control. So this one in the picture has one control. You can see one set screw here in the face. That one controls post travel. Some other models have a set screw in this area here that also controls pre-travel. So controlling the total travel of the trigger also changes the feeling and potentially even the trigger weight, how long you're pulling that trigger back, creates a very different feeling as well. The next component we're going to talk about is the trigger bow and the trigger bow spring. So the trigger bow, it's all about friction here. So it has friction with the trigger shoe in this area here. It has friction, these bumps here. They also ride on the bottom of your slide. There's a friction between the trigger bow and the trigger bow spring here. Underneath the trigger bow, you see there's these rails that this trigger bow spring rides on, and they're normally it's a very rough area for trigger bow and can benefit from some polishing. The other areas of friction here is the trigger bow has friction with the sear, it has friction with your disconnector, particularly when you're doing a double action pull. All these areas can be polished and benefit somehow if they're smoother, give you a better trigger feeling and maybe some trigger weight benefit. I would say it's more feeling than weight, and it's really sometimes really marginal. You might have as well some friction between the sides of the trigger bow and your frame, and that, in my experience, goes from gun to gun. Some guns will be in the left side, some others on the right side, some others both sides, some others just don't have friction between the trigger bow and the frame at all. Next component is the sear and the sear spring. So the sear spring it controls the pressure between the sear and the hammer. Therefore, a lighter sear spring will give you a lighter trigger pull. Technically, that's the theory there. On single action only, you're not going to notice anything in double action here. The trade-off here is that less pressure between the sear and the hammer can cause some issues depending on how much you go in that direction. So that pressure, that engagement has to be very positive between the sear and the hammer to make sure your hammer doesn't drop unexpectedly as well. And also you have a safety feature here, which is the second set of hooks in your hammer. That is the so-called pre-cocking. And that's a safety feature. So if your hammer drops unexpectedly, your sear, if there's pressure enough between the sear and the hammer, your sear is and the trigger is not pulled, obviously, your sear is gonna ride on top of the hammer on this area here of the hammer until it connects to the second set of hooks and still prevents your hammer to hit the firing pin. So that's an extra set of protection that you have there. If you go too light in the sear spring, your sear might not have a positive engagement enough with the hammer to actually catch in the second set of hooks are needed. So you got to be careful with that. Next component here is basically the engagement between the sear and the hammer itself. So this is something that I would not recommend anybody to do unless you're a professional or very experienced gunsmith, because a lot can go wrong here, and the benefit is not really not in a CZ gun. At least we're not talking about 1911 here, so the benefit is not really maybe not worth the risk of messing something up here. But this is basically like the geometry of the engagement between the sear and the hammer will have an impact on trigger feeling and trigger weight as well. So depending on how you work on that, you can have a better trigger feeling, a little bit lighter trigger in single action only. Again, this has no influence in double action whatsoever. But again, the risk is too much. If something goes wrong here, you can go in the other direction. Actually, you can make it worse. You can make it a heavier trigger or more creep um, by doing the wrong, by dimensioning this in the wrong way, and also some safety issues here. So next is a disconnector, which is a part that you're not going to see on single action only guns like the Tactical Sports Series, the Checkmate, even a Shadow 2 when it's converted to single action only. You shouldn't see a disconnector there. It's used only for double action pull. So the benefits you can have here by playing with the disconnector is on the double action pull, you will have surely some friction between the trigger bow or trigger bar in these regions here and this edge of the disconnector here, this little bump that it has. The aftermarket ones normally have an edge on one side, and the OEM has an edge on both sides that will touch both areas of the trigger bar here. So you can polish a little bit of that on both trigger bar and the disconnector to get a little bit of better trigger feeling. It's not going to do anything in trigger weight at all. The other thing you can do with the disconnector is replace by an OEM one with an oversized disconnector. And the theory is that by having an oversized disconnector, this hook here, this face of the hook is where it's going to come oversized. It comes as a much larger piece than the OEM one. And by doing that, as if you visualize that the disconnector, this hook that you see here, hooks up in this area of a trigger bow, it is actually pulling your trigger back a bit. So the larger this area is, the more backwards the trigger is going to be initially, and therefore you benefit from that on a reduced reach on double action. So your trigger is kind of a little bit more backwards than the original position, and also reducing pre-travel on single action. To do that the best way possible, actually, you're going to replace that by OEM oversized piece, like I said, and you're going to remove material. At first, your single action won't reset with the oversized disconnector, and then you start removing material from this face until it eventually resets. And at that point, if you remove material slowly enough, you will have precisely the best disconnector for your gun, like tuned, custom sized for your gun. So, and that's going to create the minimum pre-travel possible in single action and also shortest reach possible in double action. Last component here is your hammer spring. It is used to store the energy when you're cocking the hammer back and release that energy all at once when you pull the trigger, making your hammer hit the firing pin and the guns go bang. So it's basically the main force or the main resistance to you when you're pulling the trigger, particularly in double action. The main force you're trying to beat there is actually exerted by this spring being compressed. So if you go lighter in that spring, if you use a reduced power main spring, you're gonna have a lighter trigger pull. It's just physics there, right? So the trade-off here is if you go too light on that, you're going to have a very light trigger pull, but you're also going to have potentially going to have what they call light strikes. So light strikes is when your hammer doesn't hit the firing pin with enough force to get the firing pin hitting the primer and igniting the primer. So there are ways to remediate that. You can use softer primers, you can use an extended firing pin or a reduced power firing pin spring. All these steps help remediating or mitigating the risk of light strikes. But again, this is the component that will get you the best or the biggest benefit in terms of trigger weight. And it's also the good news is that it's also the easiest component to replace of all this here. So now that I covered all the components individually and how each one of them contributes to trigger weight and trigger and somehow affects your trigger feeling, you can understand that your total trigger pull weight, it's a function of adding all those components together. I put 1 here as the trigger return spring and 6 as your hammer spring or mainspring as the biggest component. So they're kind of bold and bigger. Kind of the size of the number here is how I believe, in my personal view, each of those components contribute to both trigger pull weight and trigger feeling. So that's it. That's trigger mechanism explained in 10 minutes or less.